Hello and welcome back to the Frigg'n Heathens podcast. As usual, we are Astrid, she, her.
And I'm Moxie. She, her, they, them, he, him. Just depends on the day, really.
This time, we're going to be talking about where modern heathen practices come from. We're going to briefly cover the history of modern heathenry and go into some basic terms we use as identifiers, some controversies within heathenry, and how the hell someone builds a religious practice from old ass and scant resources.
We'll also cover the future of heathenry, like where do we go from here? But we're going to start with an ultra basic history of heathenry, focusing on heathenry in the U.S. specifically because we're Americans and there's too much to cover if we go all the way back and cover the whole world.
Yeah, everything.
There is an Omnipotent Beard episode, Heathenry in America, which you can refer to. We will link below on Ocean Keltoy's channel. Him and Wolf the Red had a friend, Ryan Dennison, on, who is very knowledgeable in that subject, and I highly recommend you check out that episode.
Yeah, it's really, really good. All the Omnipotent Beard episodes are good.
They really, really are.
You should all watch them forever.
Yes.
Okay, so let's get into the history here. This was literally as short as I could get it. It's a lot, but it's interesting and it's important to know. So in the late 1700s, early 1800s, we've got German Romanticism starting as a movement. There was a focus on revitalization of German identity, which included a revival of interest in pre-Christian Germanic pagan practices. Although mostly fictional in nature and drew a lot from myth and folklore, this laid many of the bricks in the foundation for what would later be a German nationalist movement and also Odinism. And that was first mentioned in the 1820s. The Victorian era included a rise in spiritualism and to racially motivated occultism. Scald's Keep, another website that we've linked at the bottom, has an excellent timeline of nearly every single thing on here. And definitely go check that out. But in the Victorian era, one of those racially motivated occultist movements was Ariosophy, which was started by Guido von List and Jorg Lanz von Liebenfels. Funny note, Guido von List is just Guido List. He changed his name to von to sound like a noble person.
I did not know that.
He's a peasant, like the rest of us. He's a peasant. But during that time, Armanen runes were created by von List, and the Aryan movement in Germany really started to take off.
Yeah, so
that's kind of where that started.
The Volkish movement, as it was called, starts during that time as well. It's heavily romanticizing and idealizing pre-Christian Germanic culture, using a glamorous, very sterilized idea of Vikings as the ideal Germanic ancestor. Social Darwinism was popular at the time, and racial hierarchy was definitely part of the Volkish movement and the later Neo-Volkish movement that's still going on today. And we have to talk about Nazis, of course.
Always.
Sort of an outgrowth of Volkish movement. The Nazi Party took and basically bastardized a shitload of Norse imagery and symbolism, including the runes. There's some, though, like the Sonnenrad or Black Sun. It's one of the most prominent even today, is 100% a Nazi invention. The same with the Wolfsangel, the Odal rune or winged Othala rune, not just Othala, but it's got the little wings on the feet. That's specifically from von List,
an SS
I believe.
Uniform.
Yeah, an SS uniform. So let's stop talking about reclaiming these because they're not even heathen.
Please don't.
Just let it go.
We don't need it.
No.
It's fine. Okay. So next, we have in the 1960s and 70s, there was, it was obviously, if you know anything about history at all whatsoever in the U.S., that was a really huge time of social upheaval. Lots of changes were happening. Civil rights movement was happening. The Vietnam War was going on. The feminist movement was like second wave feminism was coming on. It sparked this new age movement in the U.S., including Wicca, goddess worship, kind of a return to nature sort of movement was going on.
Yeah.
And of course, that affected heathenry. And in 1972, the Asatru Association, it has an Icelandic name that I can't pronounce. It's got like 15 letters in it. I'm not even going to try. But the English translation is the Asatru Association, was formed in Iceland after a volcanic eruption happened. This was the very first heathen organization that had been created. And they had the very first public outdoor bloat in Iceland since 1000 in 1973, after the volcanic eruption was declared over, which is a neat little thing to know.
That is really cool.
And then in 1973, in England, the Committee for the Restoration of the Odinic Rite, later just known as the Odinic Rite, still around today, was created by John Gibbs Bailey and John Yowell. And it focused on racial preservation and promotion, and that's from their website, and is a whites-only organization. They don't want people to have interracial marriage, even though they admit...
Lovely.
Yeah, it's stupid. They admit that ancient peoples did that, but it's important now for whites to only marry whites to preserve white culture and white genes. Yeah, so they're actively being assholes, despite knowing better.
Gotta love it.
It's great. Yeah. But around the same time, this Danish immigrant, Elsa Christensen, brings the ideas of the Odinic Rite, thinly veiled white supremacy and ethnocentric religion, to the US with her organization, the Odinist Fellowship, which was formed in 1969 in Denmark. Stephen McNallen takes her ideas even further and forms the Viking Brotherhood in 1972, later becomes the Asatru Free Assembly in 1974. And then in 1986, a schism causes the Asatru Free Assembly to split into two groups, which will eventually become the Troth and the Asatru Folk Assembly, with the Troth on the side of inclusive heathenry and the AFA on the side of racial exclusivity. And today, those are still the two biggest and most well-established heathen organizations in the US. They have branches all over the United States. Definitely don't do the AFA. Do the Troth if you have to choose one.
Absolutely. So that brings us up to modern heathenry with its various and assorted flavors.
So many flavors. Okay, so both of us have been reading this book by Jennifer Snook. She's an American sociologist who wrote this awesome book. It's called American Heathens, The Politics of Identity in a Pagan Religious Movement, and it came out in 2015. She's also a heathen, which is really cool. And she's writing from a sociological standpoint and trying to remain as neutral as she could while gathering data and experiences from multiple heathen groups and individuals around the country, because it had never been done before. And it's an awesome, awesome book. It's really interesting to read, and she does it extremely well.
Yeah, I've really been enjoying it. Being newer to heathenry in general, I've been around paganism for a while, but heathenry in specific, I'm not as familiar with. It's given me a real good insight into how things were pre-Declaration 127, because that came out in 2016. So a lot has changed since then.
So much has changed since then.
Yeah, she describes in her book that the overall nature of heathenry at the time that she was recording interviews as being a more conservative, values focused, and, just kind of a lot more people not really speaking out against racism and kind of viewing it as more of an ethnocentric type religion, even if they weren't exclusive about it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And that has not been my experience at all in the last couple of years that I've been a heathen.
Good.
So it was really interesting to read. Yeah. Yeah, it is good.
That's fantastic. Like, I've been in the heathen community for over a decade now. And like, in my experience, heathens generally, as a population, it's changing more in the last couple of years for sure. But like, when I first started, politically, they tended to be a lot more conservative to moderate. Or at least those are the ones you could find were more conservative to moderate. And now more people are talking about that stuff, which is great.
I also, most of my experience, I have been in a couple of other communities which were very more, I will say, restrictive in their view of things. But I found the Hold Discord server and community pretty quickly. And it's very inclusive and focused on activism and being anti-racist, not just inclusive, but actively opposing those things. So that's been really great. And so my view of all of that may be skewed slightly because that is what my experience is and has been.
Well, that's good. Like, I hope that more newcomers to heathenry have that experience, because
absolutely,
it's disheartening when you show up to a bloat or a public event and you're like, oh, yay, I get to finally meet other heathens in person. I have never met another heathen in person before. And then everybody seems nice and everybody's, doing things. There's kids around, whatever. And then someone brings up the fact that, Black Lives Matter protests were garbage or something. Like, it just makes you want to never meet anybody ever again.
Understandably. I feel like
Yes.
a lot has changed since Declaration 127, though, because Snook's book, which is so fun to say, Snook's book,
it is,
was published in 2015.
Yes, 2015, also known as the before times, before COVID, before the 2016 presidential election, before Black Lives Matter protests in 2020 and 2021, before the January 6th insurrection, before Declaration 127. I really hope that she writes a follow-up to this book eventually, because so much has changed, especially within the heathen community, I feel like. And after all of this bullshit has happened over the last couple of years, progressive heathens have finally been more vocal, and they realize that they can't just ignore the idiot bigots. They have to be more visible, and they have to make their own communities and create their own organizations, and they have to do things. They can't just let the AFA start a kindergarten and not say anything about it.
Yeah. And that's a good thing. And that's something that I have experienced. That has been my experience of heathenry. And I'm really glad that that's something that is evolving currently.
Yes. Yes, yes, yes.
One thing about early heathenry in America is that Jennifer Snook mentions is that many early heathens came from a background of Wicca.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So they came kind of through the New Age movement and through Wicca, and then moved from there into heathenry.
Yep. Just because that was what was going on at the time. And if, that was what you had available. And then all of a sudden this new thing started. And that's kind of where they started out. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that, like, as we go through this episode, because it's kind of relevant to a couple of other things we're going to be talking about. But yeah, a lot of early heathens came from that scene.
Snook mentions that a lot of the establishment of identity for heathens, of establishing what is and is not, quote, authentically heathen, was based on defining what heathenry is not, as she calls the not self, and othering.
Yes. Again, this has changed a lot in the last, just even in like the last 2 or 3 years, in my experience. But
which is good.
Yeah, like early on, heathens were not, like the heathens I knew anyway, and myself, we're not really good at describing what we are.
Yeah.
We're really good at saying what we're not, though. So that is changing a little bit more, because we're creating our own identity that isn't based on just reacting to somebody else's views or beliefs or whatever.
Yeah.
So it's really cool to be around during that time in the history of our religion.
It is. And I feel like there is a sort of a predisposition to do that for new heathens, because usually coming from some other background, not a lot of people are raised heathen, because it is such a new thing, and there were not a lot of heathens. I think they feel like there are being more now that are coming up. But there aren't a lot of people who were raised that way. So you have to kind of reject your previous worldview and kind of accept this new thing. And so there's a lot of this reactionary, I'm not going to be that anymore. And we will talk more about some of that as we go as well.
Yeah, it's going to be fun.
Yes. But the Reconstructionist movement and push for a purity of worldview and practice kind of started to grow. And Snook talks about how that could become kind of gatekeepy. She references a Facebook group that includes rules for UPG to be labeled, quote, so others do not fight you on it. Snook states, accusations of poor scholarship, demands for citations, and references to scholarly proof occur daily in interactions. This constant brawling often renders Reconstructionism less a method than another politically laden identity category used to claim ownership and control over the broader heathen label, a war of authenticity that frequently escalates into bullying, name-calling, and hyper-masculine one-upmanship on the internet.
It's such a good quote.
It is a good quote, and it's true. And
it is.
Demands for this purity can be excessive, like saying you have to be just this one thing that all the ancient heathens were. First of all, because that information is inaccessible to us, because we have
but you're a stuffy recon, right?
Yeah. Well, I don't know about the stuffy part.
Yeah, I know. We try real hard not to be stuffy.
We try not to be, but yeah, the purity can be excessive, if you reject modern UPG and revivalist innovations, but we don't have a lot to go on otherwise, because we don't have any records written down from ancient heathens.
No.
Everything we have was written from someone who was writing from an outsider's perspective. So we have to fill in the gaps somehow. But I think she has a point in that being able to properly identify where your information comes from is important to understanding the why behind what you believe and do. And so long as it's not used to gatekeep belief and praxis, it's actually an excellent method for Reconstructionists, revivalists, and eclectics alike. And I think just being able to articulate the reasons why you're doing the things you're doing and you believe the way you believe, it helps yourself, not just when you're talking with others, but it helps you have a firm foundation in your own spirituality.
Yes.
Absolutely. And if that reason is because I have UPG, that this is what this God likes, or this is what works for me, that's perfect. Wonderful. I'm glad you're having those spiritual experiences, but just be aware of where that is coming from.
Yeah.
That's all I'm asking.
Yeah.
Cite your sources and label your UPG. That's it.
Yep. Yep. You do those two things, you're going to be fine.
Yeah. Snook did also mention that a lot of early heathens expressed a reluctance to innovate more elaborate rituals for fear of being labeled too Wiccan.
Oh, yeah. The too Wiccan thing. Oh, yeah. I mean, heathenry in the U.S. has never had, never. We've never had a central governing body. We're not the Catholic Church. We don't have a pope. And even locally, there's not really a governing body that has specific ritual days and specific rites that they do, all of these things. It's so all over the place, which is great. There is no real orthodoxy in heathenry, and that's part of what makes it fun.
Yeah.
And even though Wicca isn't super orthodox either, there's definitely a very formalized ritual structure within Wicca, generally led by a high priest or priestess, and there's initiation rites and all that jazz. There are no initiatory rites in heathenry.
No.
You don't have to study for a year and a day, get some secret knowledge or whatever. It's not a thing in heathenry.
Secret knowledge is not a thing in heathenry. It's all available. Everything we have is out there.
Yeah, the stuff that we want to know is secret because we don't know where the fuck it's written down, or it's in a language you can't speak, or it's been destroyed, or it never existed.
Yeah. Gotta love cultures that don't write shit down.
Oh, God. It's so annoying.
Yeah.
But earlier, in your Snook quote, you talked a little bit about hypermasculinity.
Yes. Sometimes that is referred to as brosatru. There's, it is. And
I love that term so much.
There's a great emphasis on Viking culture, and you have to have a beard and work out all the time. And none of those things are bad by themselves.
No.
But when it comes with this attitude of this is the only way to do heathenry, that's a problem.
Or you're a better heathen if you have a beard and you work out constantly. And you've got a name like Sven or
Torbjorn.
Yes.
Bjorn. All the Bjorns. There's so many Bjorns.
So many Bjorns. Again, there aren't as many Svens, which is surprising.
No, nothing wrong with
Ragnar.
The name. Yeah. Everyone has to be named Ragnar. That's it. You're not a heathen if you're not named Ragnar.
Yes. The Frigg'n Heathens podcast is hosted by your hosts, Ragnar and Ragnar.
Yes. No, not going there.
But, yeah.
Another aspect of the brosatru hypermasculine culture is the idea of Valhalla as a Viking heaven, which it's not.
No.
Warriors would go there to fight and die over and over and over and over again.
Yeah. And
be revived every day and feast with Odin, with Valkyrie serving them drinks. And unfortunately, this has led to a belief, which I have seen espoused among people, that view Valkyries as a sexual reward for those who make it to Valhalla.
That's so gross.
It is incredibly gross. And if you have read anything about Valkyries, I don't think they'd be very keen on that.
No. This is totally news to me. This is so gross. Like,
yeah.
Ow.
It
What?
it's
What? How?
It's bad.
I don't.
It's really bad.
Yeah, that's real bad.
You see memes like that floating around Facebook and things like that are it's just disgusting. There also does tend to be a focus on alcohol, particularly mead, as an integral part of heathenry. This is what the ancient heathens did, so we must do it. And one of the few drinks they had that were easily preserved was alcoholic beverages.
Yeah.
And it was also, it was hard to make. It was not a very consistent thing. They weren't always out there drinking it up. It was reserved for special celebrations for the most part, or for the very super wealthy, like jarls and kings. So to give a mead was to give like the best gift you had. It was
giving your time to brew it,
yes,
and your resources to make it, and all of this stuff.
And drinking it was a feast thing. It was something you did for a celebration. It wasn't going out and getting wasted every night.
And that's definitely a thing that I have experienced in the heathen community, is like this whole everything has to be mead all the time. And it's like, well, what if you have sober heathens at your group?
Yeah.
Do you tell them that they can't participate? Or do you let them use water? Or do you have like some other non-alcoholic beverage for them? Or do you just not deal with it at all? Like, it's a whole thing.
Yeah. There actually is another Omnipotent Beard episode on sober heathenry and toxic masculinity, which we probably should link down in the description.
We'll link that. I mean, like, really, just check out the whole Omnipotent Beard catalog. It's all good. All of it is good.
It is.
They're all very good. Another part of, like, that sort of goes with that hypermasculinity sort of thing is, like, this whole, because it's just gender, the whole Viking Age women were equal to men in Viking culture myth. Makes me crazy, because, yes, compared to other areas of the world at the time, there were some ways that Viking women had more rights than the other women in those other cultures did. There were still relatively strict gender roles to a degree, anyway. Women were still, married for property.
Often without being consulted or anything like that at all.
That's in the sagas a bunch of times.
Mm-hmm.
Like,
political alliances is like, here, have my daughter. Nobody asked the daughter.
No, because she didn't matter. It's fine.
Mm-hmm.
Whatever.
Yeah, not equal to men. Not like we are approaching today. It's not like we're equal.
Yeah.
In all things now, but we have freedoms that they did not. So to say that it was this Elysian age of equality is just wrong.
Yep, we can dream.
There's also, going along with the whole, what could be seen as like a toxic femininity, is viewing the goddesses in these traditional gendered roles, despite their associations with things that are not traditionally considered feminine. Like people seeing Freya as being purely about sex or love or things like that, and not any of her other traits, like, I don't know, war?
Yeah.
Taking half of the fallen to Folkvanger. That's not a traditionally feminine role, but people tend to ignore that in favor of, say, oh, she's all about beauty and sex and love, and she can be both things. It's okay. It's all right.
Two things can be true.
Yes.
Yes. I mean, and like this whole idea of like this traditional, and again, we say these words, but when we say traditional, we mean like American puritanical traditional.
Yes.
And so like this idea of traditional femininity can be pushed really hard in some of these heathen circles. The idea that, women are homemakers, they are domestic, that is it. That is all they are allowed to do. That is all they should do. They should be raising children, cooking meals, and letting their husbands with their beards and their gym clothes go out into the woods and, I don't know, club bears or whatever the fuck they do. I don't know. And then, like, come home and be He-Man, whatever. That's just stupid. To be feminine is so much more than that. Anything pushed as the only way for women and femme-presenting people to be is when things become a problem, regardless of what the agenda is. And that's a huge thing in a lot of, especially in folkist heathenry.
Yeah.
This idea of very strict masculine and feminine roles within a home.
Yeah, and something that's important to just mention here is there's nothing wrong with women who want to behave in what would be considered a more traditionally feminine way. If you want to stay home and cook and raise children and all of that, that's great.
Yes.
Because that's what you want to do and no one else is telling you you have to.
Yeah, if that's what makes you fulfilled and happy, awesome. I will support you in that. That's not what makes me happy, and that's okay too.
Yep.
It's all fine. There's more than one way to be feminine, just like there's more than one way to be masculine. And there's a whole lot of weirdness in the middle between both ends of that spectrum.
There
that
really
everybody overlaps.
Yep, it's not a binary thing. Just like anything with gender and sex, it is not binary.
Yep.
So there's also, as we move into modern heathenry, there have been the development of terms such as Vanatru, Rockatru, Thurstatru, and Lokian. I actually did an interview with Wolf the Red, which heartbreakingly, my sound didn't work and I didn't get all of it recorded. It was like 2 hours of stuff covering a wide range of topics. But Wolf venerates very closely Hel and works with Fenrir as well. And we'll talk about that a little more. I asked him if he identified with any of those labels because he does worship deities some would consider rocker. He said he doesn't really identify with them because to him they can seem to indicate an exclusive focus on one set of deities, kind of to the exclusion of others. And he made the point that these terms are only as useful as the individual explains what they mean to them.
Yeah.
Because people may not mean that they only venerate these deities. They just mean that may mean they include them in their praxis. But to others, it may mean, no, these are the only deities I venerate. They're still, because they're such new terms, the definition is kind of nebulous.
Yes. And we don't know a whole lot about, Moxie and I don't know a whole lot about these terms. Feel free to look them up on your own and find out more yourself. Because we're not going to say something and sound like idiots.
Yes.
Without doing it on purpose.
Yes, we'll sound like idiots on purpose all the time.
Yeah.
That's fine.
I want to be able to back it up. I don't want to say something stupid and not realize it's a stupid thing.
It is, there is some use, and Wolf made this point, and I thought it was interesting, with terms that reference a specific deity, like Lokian is a prime example. Or you'll hear Tearsman or Freya's daughter. It can indicate devotion to one specific deity, but it doesn't usually seem to indicate exclusivity. Like usually you understand that someone who is a Lokian or a Freya's daughter will probably also include other deities in their praxis. But again, it can be ambiguous unless explained. Mm-hmm. All of these terms are nebulous, and all of these are self-identifiers. So whatever you feel fits your praxis and you identify with is totally valid.
Yep.
It's just that sometimes it requires extra steps to explain.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so moving on. How did modern Reconstruction practice develop? Like why? What's the draw? Why are people doing this?
It's a good question.
Yeah, it is a good question. I ask myself this question sometimes myself. Sometimes it's because the gods just call to you. Sometimes it's because you like it. Like, it's fun to reconstruct things. It's a puzzle. It's okay to be interested because of your ancestry. It's not all ancestry bad all the time. Just don't limit yourself to focusing on your heritage and basing your whole practice around being exclusionary, because that isn't historically accurate at all. Cultural exchange is reflected in the archaeology, it's reflected in the culture, and it's reflected in the written sources. It happened, it's a real thing, stop acting like it didn't.
Yes.
Makes me angry.
Yes. So talking about the basic identifiers of heathens, there are these specific terms, but there are some broader terms as well, again, focusing on the U.S. And we're not going to go over all of them because there are too many.
There are so many.
But we do have a few we'd like to go over that are a little more common.
Yes. So we've got Norse pagan, and that would be generally anybody who deals with Norse or Germanic deities. I've met some people who prefer this over heathen or Asatru because they're 100% not Reconstructionist, or they don't identify as a Reconstructionist. It's a little bit easier for them to pull from a bunch of different other practices or different paths to build their own practice. Odinist is another one. We talked a little bit about that a minute ago. Mm-hmm. They tend to be far right, politically and socially. They're generally more ethnocentric and exclusive. I would say that they are 100% more ethnocentric and exclusive than other groups. They have the 9 noble charges along with the 9 noble virtues, which we'll get into later. It includes a charge that says to suffer no evil to go unremedied and to fight against the enemies of faith, folk, and family. And yeah, so it is all very racially motivated.
Folk is a big red flag.
Yes, it can be, especially in that context. Like in this context, big red flag.
Yeah. I keep adding things to add to the list down there, but we may want to add Wolf's video on dog whistles in Heathenry.
Oh, yeah.
That's an important thing to know with all this. We're talking about how do you identify the far right groups and what are some of the things. Because they don't always come up to you and say, hey, I'm a racist bigot.
I know. We've talked about how much easier it would be if they just did that.
Mm-hmm.
Or if they all wore swastikas all the time.
Yes.
Like if they all pulled a Charles Manson and just tattooed it on their forehead so we could easily identify them. That'd be so great.
But they don't. It's much more insidious than that. And there are ways there are ways you can tell. And these dog whistles change all the time, but there are some pretty big ones that are pretty easy to recognize once you know them. And so check out that video. It's a long one, but it is well worth the watch.
Mm-hmm. Another one that most people know is Asatru. It literally means faith in the Aesir. So the Aesir being Odin, Frigg, Thor, Heimdall, the big ones.
Yeah.
most of the big ones. Pretty much exclusively Norse. The term came to use in Iceland in the 1970s. It's a modern term. It's inclusive, though, which is good. Like, it's generally, Asatru groups are inclusive. Scholars and everyone but Americans kind of use this term for both heathens and Asatru interchangeably, but that sort of changes depending on the group of people, really. In the US, Asatru generally refers to a more organized form of Norse paganism that follows the 9 noble virtues, like the Troth. They do the hammer rite. They have specific rituals that they do. Here, the term Asatru generally refers to a more structured and hierarchical type of heathenry. But like all things heathen, this isn't a hard and fast rule.
No.
It changes. I've met Asatru who do the exact same thing I do, but they call themselves Asatru.
These are all self-identifiers, and
all of them.
There's no hard and fast rule on any of this. No. But it's good to know the overall trends.
And then we've got Anglo-Saxon heathens. If we talk about them later ever, we'll probably just refer to them as ASH. That's just an acronym. They tend to be Reconstructionists and Revivalists too. They base their practice in Anglo-Saxon sources rather than only the Norse ones. There's not anywhere near as many of them. It's not as cool to be Ash as it is to be Norse, apparently.
They don't have the Eddas and stuff. They don't have Snorri.
Yeah, but they borrow all of our shit anyway. No, we love our ash holes. It's okay.
Yes.
And I mean that with love and affection. And then there's theodism, which is bad news, y'all. Don't do it. It's super hierarchical. There is a jarl or a king, and then you have to be a thrall for a year in order to be initiated into the group, basically.
You're basically a slave. It's slavery. Yeah.
You're basically doing voluntary indentured servitude, which is slavery.
Which is bullshit. Just wild that anyone would want to recreate that in the modern day.
Yeah. And we have a link below to a podcast episode by the Heathen Bitches, which has 2 Anglo-Saxon heathens on it. We love them. We love all 3 of them.
They're wonderful.
Fantastic people.
Absolutely wonderful.
And they have a really good episode on this. And they know way more about this than we do. So Go check that out if you're interested in the big yikes on bikes that is theodism. The heathen versus Asatru thing is kind of an interesting conversation. Heathen is an umbrella term for Norse or Germanic paganism that's generally not established or structured like Asatru. But overseas, it's interchangeable with the term Asatru. You can be Reconstructionist or Revival or not. It's kind of like Wicca versus witchcraft, with Asatru being Wicca and heathenism being witchcraft. Like, all Asatru are heathen, but not all heathen are Asatru. There's overlap, but there are differences for a lot of people. Again, self-identifiers. It's all over the place.
All of it is. So how do you identify, Astrid?
I use heathen. because it allows me a little bit more freedom than a structured term like Asatru does. And despite the fact that a lot of Asatru has distanced itself from its white supremacist roots, I don't want to associate myself any more than I have to with white supremacy because it's already a thing we can't get away from as a heathen community globally anyway. So I use heathen. One example that I have of why I don't like Asatru for myself is that even though inclusive heathen groups don't use the 9 noble charges like the Odinic Rite does, they do use the 9 noble virtues still. Which are great by themselves. They're good things. Stuff like discipline and self-sufficiency and integrity and honor and like all of these things are very good. Like on their own, they're great.
Yeah.
But they were written in 1974 by John Gibbs Bailey and John Yowell. And John Yowell was a member of the British Union of Fascists in the 1930s.
Lovely.
If you've seen Peaky Blinders, you'll remember Oswald Mosley, that shitbag from Peaky Blinders was a buddy of John Yowell. And people think the 9 noble virtues are some historical nonsense when they were written in the 70s by a literal fascist. They're not historical. Stop calling them that. You can change them and do your own thing with them.
Absolutely.
But don't just I don't want to deal with it. So I just don't don't deal with it. So what do you use? Because I know it kind of goes all over the place.
It does. I use heathen mainly. It covers the idea of all Germanic religious eras and people. It's a broad meaning, pan-Germanic, and I don't necessarily limit my practice to just North sources. I do have at least one Anglo-Saxon deity in my practice right now, and I do look at sort of all over the place for my research with heathenry. I don't use Asatru because kind of what Astrid said, fuck focus. Asatru Folk Assembly is the biggest known Asatru group in the U.S., and I don't even want to for a moment to be seen as associated with them. I don't want to have to even need to clarify that. So I just stick with heathen. Also, though, I venerate the Vanir deities, not because Asatru means true to the Aesir. Mm-hmm. And yes, the Vanir deities, Freya and Freyr and Njorthur, they became Aesir after the Aesir-Vanir War and hostages were changed. But to me, they still share some features that make the distinction worthwhile. And I feel like Asatru doesn't really cover that.
Yeah.
I'll use revivalist or recon kind of. I'm not really sure where I lean into that. My praxis is more revivalism, but I think you kind of have to be because we have so little to base praxis on. But my methods are very reconstructionist. I really, surprisingly enough, being on this podcast, I'm big on sources.
No.
If you hadn't picked up on that already, I really think it's important to know the why behind the things we believe and practice. Mm-hmm. And so my methods are definitely reconstructionist, just digging into the sources and finding what's there. And I do incorporate other ideas into my practice that make sense for the time we live in and allow UPG and individualized practice, some things that may work better for me, even sometimes drawing from other traditions outside of heathenry that I can adapt to be used within heathenry. Because there was a history of varying traditions through time and place. What somebody believed in one place and may not be the same things what someone believed in a different place at the same time period even. Religion isn't a stagnant thing. Every religion has changed throughout time. If you just look at the myriad of Christian sects that exist, from this one group of 12 dudes who followed this guy named Jesus to what we have today, it is insane how much Christianity has changed. And if you look at the history of Christianity, you'll see how even the theology has changed over time. So every religion does this. So it makes...
look at the Baptists in the South, like Southern Baptists are their own thing.
They are.
And then but Baptists in Georgia look different than Baptists in Wyoming.
Yeah.
Like they practice differently. They might believe the same things, but they practice very differently.
Yes.
So that makes sense that that's a thing that has happened throughout time.
Yeah. And it's important to be able to establish practices for yourself that work for the modern day. We don't live in the Viking Age. We're not all farmers and we don't have cattle to sacrifice and we don't need to do that. We do what works for our modern practice. So
there are analogs that are modern and are relevant to us that we use instead.
Exactly. So I identify as a reconstructionist, acknowledging that I use some other aspects in my practice as well, because we have to fill in the gaps somewhere.
Yeah, and again, I feel like I need to reiterate, not all Asatru are racists or white supremacists, but as a specific sect of heathenry, They haven't thrown away as much of the Nazi stuff yet for my comfort. But again, just ask some questions.
And that is in America particularly.
Yes, specifically in America. We
Yes.
have a very long and storied history of racism in this country. And
Yes, we
it is
do.
important to ask those questions.
Yes. As we look at modern heathenry, there are some pitfalls and controversies that go into that. And
I don't know what you're talking about.
oh no, there's nothing wrong with heathenry. There's no disagreements. We all agree on everything.
Yeah, we all do the same thing.
I can't get through that sentence with a straight face. Oh my gosh, we all disagree on all the things.
I disagree with myself on things. Like,
Yeah.
what is this religion? It is it is a headache. Yeah. But like Loki and like giants, the Jotnar, that worship in general is controversial still in some places in heathenry.
Oh yeah, very.
And it's got a very, like, there's a very nebulous, ambiguous definition today, like in how we use it for Jotun and Etten and all of these specific entities. And again, there's another link to the Heathen Bitches in the description. They have a really, really great episode about this with a philologist named Ingwine. And it's a fantastic episode.
I think we'll also link Ingwine's article that he wrote on his blog, which goes over specifically in Anglo-Saxon heathenry and the sources for Anglo-Saxon sources on the various words that are used for what we would consider Ettins or giants or all of those things, and how they're used, and analyzing what we can glean from them from that. It's really insightful. Mm-hmm. And he talks about it on the Heathen Bitches podcast. We will also link the more detailed paper that he wrote there.
Worshipping those specific entities is controversial because, you know, a lot of people see them as these destroyers and these very against the gods, quote unquote, sort of entities, while still worshipping Skathi, who is a Jotun, and Aegir, who is also a Jotun.
Aegir is like the personification of the sea. He is described as his jaws devouring ships. He is like quite obviously a devourer, which is what, you know, people say they're against. But he's also depicted as feasting with the gods, hosting the gods in his hall, and they're, you know, sharing food together.
He had the best parties, like the best parties.
Yeah.
And somehow this is still a controversy. But then again, it's oh my god, that's a whole other episode.
Yes, it is.
We gotta stay on the outline here. And then we've got Loki. You want to talk about Loki?
Yes, there are people who call themselves, or who are referred to as Nokians, who believe that Loki should not ever be worshipped. The problem with that, and we're going to have a future episode. We have a lot of research to do still to be able to give a full coverage of the issue with Loki. Is that a lot of our sources are Christianized, and Snorri kind of needed a devil figure. And the more that we're looking into things, Loki really got the short end of the stick. And a lot of it that we take for granted, really, we shouldn't. There are some things there that we'll go into in a future episode, but it's not... I don't think that it is the way that it has been portrayed.
Absolutely.
Loki has really gotten maligned in a really bad way.
Yes, poor Loki.
Also, when you talk about Loki, you have to talk about his children. And as I said, Wolf the Red, who is a YouTuber and like the guy at the hold, he's the main admin and runs the hold. Ocean Keltoy kind of started it. And but Wolf is the guy who runs the day-to-day stuff. His experiences surrounding this were something I was really interested in asking him about, because he worships hell very closely, and he includes Fenrir in his practice as well. We will link, there's a video of a hell bloat that was held in the hold that Ocean wrote, and it's on Wolf's channel. They perform it together, and Wolf gives a lot of his UPG and experiences with hell at the beginning of that before they start the bloat. Go check that out. If you want some more details on his perspective on things. Mm-hmm. But when I asked him, he said he was initially, when he first entered heathenry, warned away from hell. Like a lot of people saying, you don't want to invite death into your life, or she may come and take you sooner, that kind of thing. That it was this very taboo, you don't want to deal with death deities kind of thing.
Yeah, it is very weird, because that is something that I experienced too. Like, this was maybe, 2014, 2012? I don't know. Mm-hmm. What is time?
I don't know.
It was in the before times. It doesn't matter.
Yes.
And I had mentioned that I had Hel in my hearth cult, and somebody was like, fucking why though? Like, why would you have her next to Freya and Odin and deities on your altar? Why would you do that? And I was like, 'cause she's kind of important.
Yeah.
Hello, afterlife, kind of a big deal.
She watches over our ancestors. She's charged with taking care of and providing homes for those who die and go to her realm. And that is something that Wolf has said, that in his experiences, that she is a warm maternal deity, which actually is pretty standard SPG, or a shared personal gnosis in the hold. A lot of people who've been ostracized elsewhere for their beliefs in this regard have found a place there in the hold, because there is that understanding that there's more to these deities. There's more nuance there than a lot of people have said. Wolf said at first, though, he had listened to a lot of people warning him away from hell because he was new to the faith and didn't know better. But over time, he came to question that, and his experiences and the things he read didn't really lead him to the same conclusion.
Yeah.
There again, making space for UPG and SPG, especially when lots of people are having the same kinds of experiences, it doesn't seem to hold any kind of water at all. That doesn't seem to be the way that hell is experienced.
You mean the way that people used to think, or do think, about a deity is not correct all the time?
For every person that exists on the world? What?
How? Say it ain't so. It irritates me, because, like, hell is important. She's important.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Overall, though, I would say the stigmatization of hell seems to be lessening. I know Wolf has done a lot of work towards that end, and in the hold, we talk about hell. It comes up pretty regularly.
Yeah, and I think that's part of how that stigma is leaving, is because we're talking about it more. And you're in a place where you're not automatically going to be seen as, like, the weirdo who worships death.
Yeah.
You're a heathen who's like, hey, maybe I should, like, have a chat with, the deity who's in charge of, I don't know, everyone who's ever lived that isn't still alive now.
Yeah. I actually do include hell in my hearth cult, specifically in my ancestor veneration, because, that's, if you're going to reach out to a deity and if you're going to reach out to your ancestors, like talking to one who's actually taking care of those ancestors is probably a good way to help foster that connection.
Yeah.
It has worked for
me. She's the
manager.
You got to talk to the manager first.
That's my UPG, but it has worked for me to to help with my connection with my ancestors.
Yeah, same.
Now, Fenrir seems to be a lot more controversial than hell. Ocean Keltoy has made a video on that, talking about what the historical sources say and ways that can be interpreted. And there is a cameo from Wolf in there where he talks about what his praxis with Fenrir looks like. We will put a link to that in there, so I'm not going to go over all that now. In the interview, Wolf did say that he's been called all sorts of things and even ostracized and kicked out of communities for his stance on Fenrir in particular. So
that's wild.
It's still right now a very, very controversial thing.
Loki is in a weird gray area. Like, there are still a lot of people who are like, you can worship Loki in your own time, but not with my group. You can't do it.
Yeah, which is weird.
Fenrir is like a whole new level of get the fuck out.
For a lot of people, really
which is so weird. It's so strange. It's all strange to me. But
Ocean goes over some very interesting ways that Fenrir can be looked at. That is, it was very insightful to me, that video. So I would recommend you definitely check that one out.
Absolutely.
But that is kind of a brief summation, as much as it doesn't seem brief. It was a brief summation of some of the issues. It was
originally, damn it. We just can't stop talking. It's
okay. Of the issue with Jotuns and Edens. That was...
Yes.
Yeah.
So, another one of the sort of pitfalls and issues within modern heathenry specifically is that we have a serious lack of surviving written sources about ritual structure, ritual reasons, practice in general, especially daily practice. We know basically nothing about daily practice, what it would have looked like.
Nothing.
All of that stuff. We don't know any of it.
And it's... So if you're looking at where our modern ritual structures come from, when I first came into heathenry, I found the longship.net website, and they base their practice off of sort of a Roman or Greek ritual structure. There's like petitioning the gatekeeper and then speaking to the hearth deity. And like you need these deities in order to be able to reach the other deities. And there's this very formalized structure to it. So that's one place a lot of people go.
Yes.
Is to the classical mythology and classical practices of Rome and Greece.
Because they are very well documented.
Very well documented. Yes, I am envious of the documentation in comparison.
Yes. Absolutely. They're all written down. They're all, well, not all of them, but a lot of them are written down, like the step by step even. And a lot of Wicca and other like witchcraft centered practices pull that same sort of structure, like that kind of Greek Roman ritual structure sort of thing where there's all these different steps that you can sort of interpret how you want. Like in heathenry, bloats tend to follow the format of like a hallowing. So you're making a sacred space. You're doing an invocation. So then you're calling to the god or the gods you're worshiping, explaining why you're there to the people who are also there with you, if you with a group, all of that stuff. And then you've got a prayer and or a blessing. So usually this is like the meat and potatoes of the bloat. Mm-hmm. This is where you do the thing you're there to do. And then you've got offering or sacrifice. So usually it's votives. So it's something representing an animal. We don't do people.
No.
Incense is good. Food is good. Water is good. All of those things are good. Whatever. And then there's a closing for the ritual. So you thank the gods, you declare the bloat over, and you close that space. It's not the same everywhere or every single time. And it's not always even in that order, but generally that's how heathen ritual is structured today. A lot of Asatru and heathen holidays include days to celebrate heroes, which is a totally weird modern invention. Some people do that.
There is a pressure to reclaim days from Christians. So a lot of holidays and festivals are around the same time or have similar themes. Some of those are historically based and some of those are not. And we will get into holidays a little more as we go.
Yes. And, you know, it's interesting to talk about ritual structure because as I was thinking about just the bloats that I've done, a lot of churches do the same thing. You're making the space sacred when you come in. There's organ music playing, or there's, you know, if you're in a Catholic church, you've got people burning incense and censers, and then you do all the things, and then you close it out. Like there's a beginning and a middle and an end, and there's all these steps in the middle that could be in any order you want them to be, or none of them. It's all over.
So we cannot avoid talking once again when it comes to pitfalls in modern heathenry about heritage and race. Let's just get it out of the way right now and say that the idea that it is restricted to bloodlines is completely ahistorical. It ignores the practice of adoption, very common practice of adoption in heathen records, what we have, where if you adopted someone, they were considered your family, just your family. They had the same rights as a child that was born of blood. There was no difference viewed at all. And it didn't matter the race. It didn't matter the bloodline. It's just ahistorical to say that race matters. And it also ignores the fluidity of polytheistic religions. And there's a history of syncretization. We see deities that are not technically heathen being worshipped in heathen places. You have Isis, who migrated all over the world.
Yeah.
In a lot of Germanic cultures, worshiping Isis in a heathen context.
Mm-hmm. In Bath, England, there's a Roman bath that's for Minerva, who is a Roman goddess. It went all over the place. There was syncretization everywhere.
Absolutely.
But yeah, there's this weird sort of uniquely American issue of being a nation of immigrants. And this is gonna get me some hate mail, but whatever. We, meaning non-Indigenous people, are to some degree strangers in a strange land in the United States when compared to people in sagas and our ancestors who lived and worked in the same areas and culture for generations at a time. They never left, they never moved, they stayed in a relatively isolated place their entire lives for generations. Mm-hmm. And I think this has really influenced the whole conversation about heritage in the US. White people have the privilege of kind of quote unquote shopping for ethnic identity, as Snook said in her book, among whatever ancestors they have. or choosing one of their own, regardless of their lived experiences in that culture or identity in its home element. It's interesting.
It's interesting. It can also become a little problematic when it kind of steps on the toes of existing beliefs within people who are actually still part of that culture.
Yes. Yeah, it has to be done carefully.
Respectfully. With respect.
I'll be upfront. Like, I started getting into heathenry again because I had been turned off by some fucking white supremacists when I had first been interested in it, and then left it alone for a while. And then came back to it because I was interested in my family, and my family's Norwegian and German. And I was like, all right, well, this is interesting. Let's read this. And then it kind of kickstarted a lot of things for me. But, there's this lack of place. We don't have that sense of place that a lot of the people do in the sagas, or people who live in the places that the sagas are written about.
Yeah.
It's a weird thing for Americans. It's very strange. But Snook's book, again, so fun to say, has an awesome section on this in chapter 6 that on its own is worth reading. Just if there's nothing else you read in this entire book, read that chapter. It's great. She does a much better job of covering that than I did.
Moving on from race, another pitfall we have is the problem of orthodoxy.
Ugh, this is almost as annoying as the problem of race.
It is so annoying. The idea that there is one proper way to believe.
It's gross.
We don't have enough information to have one true heathen belief. In fact, the information that we have shows that there were, in fact, many, many ways that heathen believed things very differently in ancient times.
Yes.
And I feel like
a lot of the things that people come up with as far as trying to make like standardized beliefs within heathenry is this weird overcorrection of leaving Christianity and like this trying to make everybody believe the same thing or want everybody to believe the same thing, because that's what Christians do. Which really isn't true either, but like...
No, but it's the impression that you're given a lot of times growing up in Christian circles, and it's what you're familiar with, right?
Yes. And overcorrection from heathens, leaving Christianity, also leads to some other weird hang-ups, like a resistance to praying and kneeling, and the whole, like, we don't kneel for our gods thing is total horseshit. Lots of evidence in sagas and stories about people kneeling or prostrating themselves before the gods exists in sources.
In fact,
it is 100% a thing.
From the Troth, they have put out a couple books, Our Troth, and there's like a Volume 1 and Volume 2 now, I believe. But there is an older version of what they had written saved on their website on archive.org. And a couple quotes about the idea of kneeling or prostrating before the gods. And this is all quote here. Even the old Norwegian rune poem is suggestive. Sun is the light of the lands. I bow to the holy doom. The verb here, luta, means to lout down, to bow, as when Thomas the Rhymer met the Queen of Faery and louted down upon one knee. One form of prayer may have involved standing with upraised arms in the form of the Elhaz rune, but apparently at times the Germanic peoples also bowed down in adoration, especially it would appear in honoring the sun. A line in the Solarlioth, maybe?
I don't know.
States, I louted to her, the sun, for the last time in life's world, meaning that it was the last day of the speaker's life, is even more indicative. Bowing to the holy doom, therefore, is not necessarily an expression either of Norse fatalism or Christian influence, but could be a reference to a daily ritual of alignment with the forces that govern the fate of all beings as represented by the daily journey of the sun. So we have references in our lore that say we bowed down, like actually bowed down before the gods, before Sol, specifically in this example. There are plenty of other examples in the Artroth books, and they're worth getting for their...
just the bibliography alone.
Yeah,
is worth
it's
it.
Excellent research. The amount of sources they have in there is astounding.
Yes. And like, you would think, okay, you know that Viking people kneeled before kings. We know that. Why wouldn't they also kneel before a god?
Seriously.
When gods are clearly a bigger deal, maybe?
Mm-hmm. a little bit, yeah.
Like, it's not a leap to think that. It's not a leap, people.
We have records. We have records of them doing exactly that. So it's just, you can't say we don't kneel down before the gods when we say, yeah, they actually did. We have those records.
Yeah, we don't bow down like you do, you little weaklings, in front of your Christian god. It's like, no, that's not why they do that.
Yeah.
It's very irritating. This localization of myth and practice absolutely happened. People on the west coast of Norway, where there is no farmland, and those living in Denmark, which is all farmland, might have believed similar things, but they executed them completely differently because the places that they lived and the way that their lives were, what they experienced, all of those things were different. Localizing myths happened. That's why we have conflicting stories about the same gods.
Yeah,
and
it's just... Orthodoxy is just not historically accurate.
And it's boring. Like, it's just boring.
It is. Another example of variation of belief over time and place is there is a conflict over who is the high god. Like, Odin is referenced as the All-Father. All-Father. Very appropriate.
Freudian slip.
Yes. Slip. But Tyr also etymologically is associated with beings that are more attested as the Sky Father. There are very good arguments both ways because people believe different things. So it's okay.
What's really important to people in one place might not be the same level of importance to somebody in somewhere else.
Yeah.
And it would make complete sense for somebody to worship a specific deity if they lived in Western Norway where all they could do was fish, like that they worshipped Norther at a much greater frequency than they did Freyr.
Absolutely.
Like, that makes sense. Like, they did Freyr, if they worshipped Freyr more often in, like, the southern parts of Norway and Sweden, where it's flatter and there's more farmland. That makes sense. It's just, there was no one way to be heathen, just like there is not one way to be heathen now. And people need to let it go. Let it go.
Speaking of let it go, a modern example of the problem with orthodoxy is... Yule, and you will notice this particularly in Saxon and Anglo-Saxon spaces. There is a individual by the name of Robert Sass, who is an old Saxon heathen. He likes to make a stink every year around the solstice about how Yule is properly dated sometime in January based on lunar cycles rather than the typical winter celebrations around the solstice. And as near as I can tell, the sources for this on the more Anglo-Saxon sources, which are quoted by those who worship around the solstice time, is Bede's Reckoning of Time. It is an Anglo-Saxon era treatise written in medieval Latin by the Northumbrian monk Bede in 725 CE. Sometimes you'll hear him referred to as the Venerable Bede. It covers various ancient calendars, including an Anglo-Saxon calendar. Its purpose was to accurately date the proper time for the celebration of Easter. So its whole point was to get timing down.
To Easter.
To Easter.
Like
yes.
Nothing else. It was to Easter.
Just to Easter. Like, when should we celebrate Easter? And let me go back to all of these ancient calendars and figure out how they correlate so we can figure out in our modern calendar where that would fall. So its whole point was about time and dating things. As far as I can tell, the other source that Sass and those who agree with him go by is a paper by Andreas Nordberg, which is written in Swedish, and I cannot pronounce it. And I cannot find an English copy of, but it seems to use as its source Thietmar of Merseburg's Chronicles. They were written between 1012 and 1018. It is comprised of 8 books that cover the period between 908 and 1018 CE. Its purpose was to chronicle the history of rulers of the Saxon dynasty, both kings and popes. An English translation exists, but I really don't give a fuck enough about it to buy it to try to figure out where in there Yule may be mentioned or something that could be...
Once or twice, maybe?
Yes. It's really a bunch of heathens being pedantic about calendars is what it really comes down to.
It really, oh God, it really is. Like, you bring up the word sass in an Anglo-Saxon group of heathens, holy shit, all hell will break loose immediately. You will have people yelling and just, it's eye-rolling, like, holy crap. I love it.
If you really look at it, though, like the dates they were written are drastically different. There's about 300 years of difference between them. Yeah, about 250 to 300 years between the dates of the time periods they were recording. it's one's a Saxon source, one is an Anglo-Saxon source. It is valid to consider it more of a demonstration of the variation of practice in different times and places than it is a matter of orthodoxy.
Yes.
Yeah, maybe they celebrated Yule in the middle of January in the Saxon dynasty. That's fine. Maybe the Anglo-Saxons celebrated it more around the solstice. That's also fine.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe I celebrate it on Christmas because we already have the Christmas tree up.
Yeah,
and that's fine.
You've already got all this pagan shit up. Like,
Seriously.
you got lights, you got twinkle lights, you got snowflakes, there's a big evergreen tree in your house, there's reeds, you're brewing apple cider or whatever the fuck.
You already have the festive atmosphere all around you and the entire culture. It just makes sense to do it when it works for you. So
yeah, that's okay too. Like, some people enjoy being annoyingly pedantic about the date and time of specific rituals, and a lot of people don't. I do not enjoy being pedantic about that kind of shit, so I don't care as much.
Speaking of holidays and dating things, how the fuck do we know any of these things, and does it matter really?
Like you were talking about with the Yule thing, like with Snorri's writings, we basically know there was a Yule celebration. Something at the beginning of winter, too, which is called winter finding now, and something in the spring. Like, we know for a fact those three things happened. Primstavs, which were basically calendar sticks that were used to date things. One side would have one half of the year, and then the other side would have the other half of the year on it. And it would have little symbols to indicate when holidays happened and like when important things happened, like when you would plant seeds, when you would harvest this thing. There's lots of stuff on them. They're really cool to look at. You can find them online. All of the ones that we have that survive are from the middle, like the later medieval period, because they're made of wood. They're not going to survive.
Yeah.
But it is interesting to see those things because we know that they celebrated some of this stuff. And then we've got like this whole issue of Halloween and Samhain and alpha bloat and what the fuck is all of this nonsense? Like, I'm American and October is Halloween month.
It's spooky month.
It is a whole month. It is not a day. It is not October 31st. It starts October 1st. Sometimes it starts earlier. Depends on how I'm feeling. As an American, you know, death and the spirit world is already kind of on my brain that time of year. So I've always held a hell bloat on or around Halloween. I'm already in that headspace. It makes sense to me to do that then. I know a lot of heathens do that as well, just because, again, culturally, we're already in that headspace. It's the same idea as celebrating Yule on or around Christmas because you're already in that headspace. It's already festive. The rest of the world is also being festive. So you're like, hooray, everybody else is celebrating Yule. Let's do it now.
Yeah.
Alpha bloat is mentioned in some skaldic poetry, so we know that it's old. And I guess it has to do with a sacrifice to the elves who are linked to ancestors somehow. I don't know a whole lot about alpha bloat, but that happens. Like, a lot more strict recons than me celebrate alpha bloat on or around Halloween. Because that is, I guess, technically the more historically accurate holiday to celebrate, but I like doing a hell bloat because I like it.
Yeah.
And then you've got this house bloat or winter finding, which is the last harvest of the year. You prep for winter. It's generally around the autumnal equinox, so that date changes, but some people celebrate one or two of these things, or all of these things, or none of them. It varies from place to place and person to person.
I'm basically right now just celebrating holidays in alignment with what the community does. Like Yule and Midsummer, we have big events where we get together, and so I'm celebrating those.
Mm-hmm.
We have a hell bloat sometime around October, and so I celebrate that. Yeah, I don't go out of my way to find textual evidence for ancient holidays and try to figure out what the fuck that even meant to begin with, much less how to do it.
Yes.
When I spoke to Wolf, he mentioned that you can heathenize modern holidays. For example, Easter is celebrating Aostra instead. And that really...
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. Any modern holiday can be viewed and you can observe the holiday through a heathen lens. Like, just take the themes that are in that holiday and put it through a heathen lens. And that is that's a really good way, I think, of using a revivalist approach in your practice. It's saying, this is the culture we live in. Here's the things that the society around us are doing. We don't have to say we are not of this world. We are separated from it, which is, to my opinion, a very Christian view, having grown up in a church that espoused that very strongly. Be in the world, but not of it. We are, in fact, in this world, and we're part of the culture that we're in. And taking culturally relevant holidays and celebrating them from our heathen perspective is entirely valid.
Totally. 100%. That is absolutely valid. And like I know a lot of heathens who tend to follow more of like the Wiccan Wheel of the Year sort of thing. So they do like Beltane, May 1st, they tend to celebrate Freya. Or the summer solstice, they do Sunna. And then, they tend to follow that because it's easy to access and it's all set up. Mm-hmm. You just make it heathen.
Yep.
That's completely valid. And like another thing that we talk about a lot that also sort of is one of those things is adapting UPG for modern practice along with those historical sources, which is what we both do.
Yes, UPG is a huge part of Reconstruction because you have to fill in the gaps somehow. And with the scarcity of info surrounding ritual structure, holidays, daily practice, it leaves us free to experiment. So it's actually very exciting in a way.
Yeah.
And with UPG, huge thing in heathenry is the importance of reciprocity and forming relationships with deity. And then if you're going to have a relationship with the deity, responding to the feedback from them as individuals with agency and personhood, which is the view I tend to take of them, is very important. If you're going to have a relationship, it needs to be a two-way street. And if you feel like this is what works best for you in your relationship with this deity, absolutely take that into consideration.
Yeah. I mean, and the gifting cycle, I would argue, is at the very center of heathenry. Mm-hmm. It's really important in how we relate to the gods and other entities that we worship or work with. This give and take and this constant cycle of giving is the very, very core of heathenry for me specifically. It's not a transactional kind of gifting cycle thing where you pray, you get a thing, and then you give a thing, you get a thing.
No.
That's not how it works. It's this, you give freely in hopes that that deity will also give to you freely. It's a friendship. It's a relationship. You don't just, it's not transactional.
Exactly.
Gods are not vending machines.
That's exactly it.
So one of the big pitfalls in contemporary heathenry is the introductory books that you find at the bookstore.
Yes.
Yeah. Most of them aren't like actively harmful, but nearly all of them, all of the ones that I have read anyway, could be better. There are good things in almost every single one I've read. And I've read a lot of them. But I have yet to find one that doesn't have at least a handful of things that make me go, that's not right. Or absolutely fucking not. Or there's so much more to this subject than you're letting on. And that's so frustrating. And that's coming from someone who's been involved in this for 12 years or whatever.
Yeah.
I can't even imagine dealing with that as a newcomer.
Because you don't know what to pick out and what you don't. And when you're coming into heathenry and here's someone who seems to have credentials in what they do enough to get a book published anyway, you kind of take that as, oh, this is how things are. And in fact, some of those things really do not reflect sometimes even the sources that we have. Sometimes they're even just completely misrepresenting.
Yeah. It's very important to read intro books with a very critical mindset.
And once again, check citations.
Mm-hmm.
Double check things.
Look at the author.
Go through your crap test.
Mm-hmm. See if it's crap or not.
See if it's crap or not. Yes.
It's important. And you gotta read. If you read like 5 of them, you'll have a pretty decent idea of what's going on. You can't just read one introductory book and have all of the tools you will need.
No.
That's not how it works, unfortunately. I wish there was one that was like, here is the Golden Book of Heathen Information.
I really
Read
wish
it
we
and
had
thou
one.
shalt know things. Yes,
Yeah.
I wish we did too.
Wish we had one that I could say, this is, here, read this one. Read this one and you'll have a good start, at least. But I don't know of one that I couldn't give you without caveats. And we don't have time for that in this episode because it's a really long one. So
it's already really long.
we're going to move on. Where do we go from here? How do we continue to grow heathenry and develop practices? And how do we do those things with an informed mind?
Ooh.
So now that we've covered where we are in modern heathenry, what do we see going forward?
Well, you've got a lot of people building communities, which is fantastic. You've got a lot of online and offline communities, kindreds, open circles, Unitarian Universalist churches, covens in some cases. Like, all of those things have become more common, especially on the inclusive side of heathenry in the last 5 years, maybe.
Mm-hmm.
Avoiding focus groups is going to be key there if you're looking for a community. So checking to see if they support Declaration 127 and the Declaration of Deeds is like the baseline that you should follow or agree with, in my opinion. It's like the bottom of the barrel. The bar is so low, people.
It really is.
It is so low. And making communities more publicly visible and easier to find as heathenry grows is important. Making sure we have support to be out of the broom closet, as they say.
Yeah.
And a lot of these communities have, thankfully, this is changing. Most groups had this no politics rule, and I get it to some degree. Depending on the group you're in, if you're in a large community group, either serving the military or a local church where the purpose is worship and not necessarily community building, I understand focusing more on the religion and the worship part rather than the politics. That makes sense in that context. But if you're ignoring the politics completely, that's dumb, regardless of what the situation is.
Yeah.
It's stupid. It's not a support community if you can't talk about things that directly impact the people in your community.
Exactly. And that's something that I've been thinking about a lot. In America, we just had an election season, and they're getting more and more contentious as we go through the years. And had a lot of takes that I would consider very bad takes politically. And it's like we have so much of a problem in this country with people wanting to take away the rights of AFAB people wanting to take away the rights of trans people. And if you want to try to say, well, I'm just not going to take a side, or what you're saying is, I'm not.
You are taking a side.
You are taking a side. You're saying, I'm going to allow these things to happen. I'm going to allow these people to have their rights taken away. And when you're talking about a religious community that is supposed to be a group of people coming together to support one another, assuming you have anyone who is AFAB in your group here in America, or anyone who is trans, or some sort of LGBTQ identity, you cannot be a supportive member of that community and just allow them to be completely legislated against and try to legislate these people out of existence. I mean, it's really frightening, and
it is.
I don't want people around me who are just going to stand there and say, well, whatever happens, happens. It's not going to affect me anyway.
We don't talk about politics.
We don't talk about politics.
Simply religion.
It's like, who I am is not political. It is political, but it shouldn't be something that I shouldn't have to not talk about my identity because you don't want to talk about things that are controversial, which is what that comes down to.
Mm-hmm. Stupid. It's a stupid rule. Personally, I tend to avoid groups that have a no politics rule because I think it's a stupid rule. But there are groups out there that say no politics, or we are politically neutral, or as an organization, we don't take a stance. And I get that. I have been involved with groups that were run on military bases because I'm a military spouse. And them not taking as an organization, taking a political stance on something, I get that. That's not their intention. That's not what they're there for. Their purpose is not that. If they chose a side, they would be alienating half of their community or more of their community.
And it's a community that's kind of limited in their chances for community building because of the nature of the military.
Yeah, so I get it. I get it there, but it's still stupid.
Yeah.
But as far as other stuff with where we go from here, like we said before, we don't have a lot as far as ritual structure goes. So that gives a lot of freedom with playing with ritual structure. We only have a handful of actual references to heathen rituals that the Old Norse actually did in historical sources. So we borrow a lot from Anglo-Saxon sources, and a lot of older heathen groups used kind of a Wicca ritual format because they didn't have anything else. And so reconstructing historical heathen rituals is like having someone driving a noisy dump truck 3 streets over, yell the steps at you, while there's also a block party happening between you and them, and there's some weird game of telephone happening at a multiple points through along the way, so you kind of hear some of it from the actual person yelling on the dump truck. And then you get all this conflicting stuff from other people as they try to relate to you what they heard from the person standing on like, it's...
It's so true, though. That's perfect.
It's just a shit show. Like, you have to sift through all of this other information that other people have interpreted before you.
Yeah.
And, like, at some point, you're just like, fuck it, I've got to hunt down this dump truck. And then you start chasing the dump truck. And you can't catch up to it because it stopped working over 1,000 years ago. And it's just... Like,
I think the analogy is breaking down a bit here.
Yes, it is. I'm sorry. But yeah, like, we have no sources. So what we do have is gets filtered through a lot of different people and a lot of different lenses, and it's really hard to sift through.
Yeah, you have people coming in who they do the ritual structure they do because the people who taught them heathenry did the ritual structure that way because the people who taught them heathenry did the rituals that way. And there's a little variation here and there, like the game of telephone, but it's like...
Ugh, it's a headache.
We don't have anything historically to base these things on necessarily that's explicitly heathen. So
yeah,
we have some room to play with that if you want to. It really does.
You've been doing this.
I have, yes.
You've been doing this in a really cool way.
We had in the hold, we hold rituals periodically, and they're usually heathen rituals, but one of our mods, Celery, is a Kemetic, and she held a Kemetic ritual in the hold, and there were parts of that were just absolutely and completely just blew my mind. It was so moving to me. I think it's important to individualize your practice to fit your own preferences. And for me, I write poetry, and I really like poetry and metaphor. I really like some things that are more like have more ceremony and liturgy involved. Not that it's always the same, but that you have this sort of the lull of the repetition and all of the poetic forms that you can use. And Kemetics have a lot of that. Their ritual format is incredibly beautiful. And Kemetics have actual complete preserved rituals.
Yup. With directions.
On how to do it and what to say and the positions to stand in and all of these things. It's so incredibly beautiful. I have been reading Richard J. I don't know if it's Riedy or Riedy. It's Riedy. His book, Eternal Egypt, Ancient Rituals for the Modern World. And it goes over, outlines step by step, a bunch of different rituals. And also, though, breaks down kind of the why behind doing some of the steps. There are so many theological differences between Kemetics and heathens. For one, ritual is inherently magical. In Kemetic ritual, there is no separation between magic and religious. They're the same thing. It's a Heka is the practice. There's a quote from Eternal Egypt. We need to be very clear about this. Ritual actions on the earthly plane do not simply mimic divine acts. In a mystical sense, they become those divine actions. We do not have a parallel for that in
not
heathenry.
Really.
That's not really, we don't think that we're becoming, that the offerings become a mythological thing. For instance, there's the Eye of Heru or Horus is very mythologically significant, and I'll read the quote about that. The Eye of Heru is that victorious life restored after its injury is healed, just as the god Heru's eye is healed and made sound or whole again after having been injured in cosmic battle. Once blinded, it is now restored to wholeness. The Eye of Heru possesses the power of renewal, the creative power of the god. Both gods and humans are restored and renewed by offerings. Once those offerings are transformed through the power of naming into the Eye of Heru. The priest names the offerings as the Eye of Heru, and through this magically potent act of speech, the offering is revealed as containing divine life itself, a divine life emanating from the products of the earth.
So cool.
It's so cool, and it is so not heathen.
No. Not at all.
So that's
because like Kemetics who do like Egyptian reconstructionism, they eat their offerings.
Yes,
it can.
It is the reversion of offerings. That is one of the steps of the ritual.
It's so cool.
It's very different. And so it's become kind of like a bit of a deep dive into comparative myth and theology for me. I have to take those elements of Kemetic liturgy that really resonate with me and then adapt them to fit a heathen worldview.
Yes.
That, you know, they use kennings for gods and they refer to the myths and all of those things, which we do very well. But for example, with the Eye of Heru, I don't believe that my offerings actually become a gift that the god has previously received in a myth. That's not a heathen thing. So what I have written refers to gifts gods have received in the past as metaphor. So, for example, a small part of what I have written when giving an offering, I would say, like the apples of Idun, may these offerings refresh you. Like the creations of Broker and Sindri, may these offerings honor you. Like the gifts of Ivaldi's sons, may these offerings please you.
Holy shit.
I really like the repetition and the metaphor there, you know, but using it as metaphor.
That is so cool. Moxie.
I'm still working on it. I'll probably share some of what I write when I finally get it all ironed out. But I'm working on that.
Yes, that is so cool.
And because that's what works for me personally. And I know it probably won't vibe with a lot of people who want to stick with more authentically heathen things, but in my own personal practice, when I'm writing a ritual, the meat and potatoes of the ritual for me is usually in the form of a poem. And to go from what I have been, what is taught to me as a standard heathen structure, and then go into this poem with alliteration and metaphor and all of that, it is such a tone shift.
It is.
That it really takes me out of the mindset of the ritual mindset. And so using a ritual format that works with the way that I tend to interact with the gods helps me to stay in that ritual mindset a little more and to get there in the first place. So that's not going to work for everybody. What I do is not going to be probably most people's cup of tea in heathenry. I'm aware of that.
But it's really cool, though. It is super. It is really great.
It's really fun. Yeah, I get to do more research, which is really, really fun.
We don't like that at all. No research. No. Nope.
So do you have any final thoughts?
Yeah, I guess we could wrap it up. It's been so long.
It has been a while.
Final thoughts would probably be modern heathenry, particularly in the US, is as diverse as modern Americans are, despite the efforts of some groups to make it racially exclusive or theologically orthodox or whatever nonsense. The biggest thing I have to say about modern heathenry is to make your practice relevant to your life. You aren't a Viking. I hate to break it to you.
It's sad.
I know. I like modern medicine, though. You aren't you aren't an Old Norse person. You're a human living in 2022. And your religious practice should reflect and support that. And recognizing what parts of the original culture don't work for you in the 2020s is good. Don't use them.
Absolutely. I would say, to wrap up, that, you know, a lot of modern heathen practice has been influenced by other heathens, and to an extent differentiating ourselves from practices that are not heathen. But our religion is very, very young, despite its ancient origins. And it will continue to evolve and develop as we experiment and interact with one another. So don't be afraid to try new things.
Yeah.
And maybe they work and maybe they won't, but you won't know till you try. Heathenry is a highly individual religion with no central authority to hand down orthodoxy.
Nope.
You do you.
Mm-hmm.
And the last thing I really want to say is to talk to other heathens about your praxis and your UPG, particularly in shared communities where you have an established trust, because being exposed to different ideas can force us to examine our own beliefs, and it may change them or it may strengthen our own convictions. And a lot of people are afraid of having their deeply held beliefs challenged. But for me, that's where the excitement lies, is when there's this new idea and you can say, wait, does this fit? If so, where does this fit? Do I need to rethink some things? This is new information to me. You know, it brings you closer and closer to understanding your own spirituality better when you can compare and contrast that with what others are doing. So I think it's a really, really important thing to find a place where you can actually be open and share your praxis and experiences with the gods, and to be willing to do that.
Totally. Okay. I think that's it.
Finally.
God,
we'll stop
this episode was so long. Yeah. So we'll see y'all next time. Enjoy the very long episode. Remember to like, subscribe, follow, whatever the button is on the platform you're on. And please leave us comments. What do you do if you're a modern heathen? What do you think about the things we've talked about? Let us know. And remember to cite your sources and label your UPG and always question everything. We'll see you next time.